and welcome to another hour of discussion with me and a guest. That's the format of the program, which you can find in the Discussions with David playlist on my YouTube channel and in podcast form if you search for This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform. Today's guest is my friend Walter Chee and Tom. If you search for his name online, you will quickly discover that he's a lawyer in Montreal involved with defending people's human rights, often involving cases of discrimination of one form or another. Such a web search will hardly begin to shine a light on the man, however. I don't remember exactly when I first met Walter, but it was probably soon after Montreal became a regular stop on my world tours, which was a long time ago. It could have been at an event in opposition to the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, or it could just as easily have been an event in defense of refugees or in support of the teachers' union. If I hadn't met him at one such event, I would probably have met him at another. There are quite a few radicals in Montreal, but not that many. Walter grew up in Montreal, where his parents ran a restaurant in Chinatown. He learned to fold dumplings at a very young age. As a lawyer many decades later, he continues to be very involved with defending people in Chinatown and many other communities. I don't know the timeline exactly. I'm giving you this bio from memory, but somewhere along the line, becoming a lawyer and human rights activist, Walter developed an exhaustive knowledge of Canadian history with a specialization on the history of Asian exclusion laws, which incidentally were passed in both the US and Canada in the same time period. Walter has traveled very extensively, not only spending part of last summer with me and my family in Denmark, but he spent quite a bit of time in Colombia. He became fluent in Spanish along the way, along with French and English, which he grew up with in Montreal. And among other travels, he went to Tiananmen Square to join the protests there as a young man in 1989. I only learned about that when he and I were taking a walk through the massive Occupy Wall Street encampment in Montreal in the fall of 2011, and the smell reminded him of Tiananmen in 1989. One thing I learned at Tiananmen, he told me, is revolution is dirty. Walter, welcome to my little live stream show.
Hi, David.
Hi.
Yeah, it brings back memories.
Does it? Yeah, me too. But
Yeah.
and the well, I wanted to just first ask you about this recent thing that I just heard about from you in a recent conversation, because it just blew my mind, especially since we've all been hearing that Canada is dealing with this whole thing much better than in the US, but they kicked the students out of the housing, or they tried to kick them out of housing at Concordia with like 4 days notice.
Yeah, essentially, unfortunately, it's not just in Montreal. It's been throughout Canada, and from what I understand, it's also prevalent in the United States as well. Is that international students, in particular, but students from outside the city, oftentimes they need to have a place to stay, especially if they're new to the city. They don't know the city. And so student residences and dorms are like a really safe space for them, in order to integrate into the city, because they don't have family around. They don't have friends around. It's a new setting for them. They're young people. They're learning how to adjust to being on their own. And student residents are oftentimes a safe space for them to transition to eventually having perhaps their own apartments. Now, the thing that's been shocking about all this is that even though, for example, the universities are supposed to be looking after these young people, that's the whole idea of student residence. Unfortunately, like many other institutions, when it comes down to the bottom line, it's a question of, well, COVID-19, oh my God, how can we be held responsible for that? What if what if some of these students get sick in our student residence? What are what are the costs of that? And when it comes down to, unfortunately, cost benefits, right? It's really not for the benefit of the student that they're kicking these students out into the streets. It's really more for the benefit of the university. So it was quite shocking that when the university had announced, oh well, for the benefit of of all the students in the dorms, we're asking them to move out of the dorms. They're much safer outside of the dorms. Safer.
How do they rationalize that? How are they safer, and how is society safer? I mean, this is the university. They're supposed to be thinking in terms of society at a time like this, right?
Well, I mean, their reasoning was, oh, social distancing. Okay. Or, I prefer the term physical distancing. But that being said, oh, now, everyone has to be, 2 meters apart from each other. You can't be in groups of 10. Now, for sure that in a dorm situation, right, it's difficult for, students to necessarily maintain that physical distancing. But when you compare it, okay, to what the alternative is, and that is trying to find, an apartment or a residence outside of the student residence in this crisis situation in which landlords don't want to meet with you, and no need
In a city with a 1% vacancy rate, I believe.
absolutely. And in the best of times, it's difficult enough for a person for a tenant to get an apartment. And that's not even talking about how vulnerable tenants are to begin with. I mean, it's true that in Quebec, in Montreal, we do have very strong, rental laws. But on the other hand, the law is one thing and the enforcement is another. Because one of the first things that closed was what we call the rental board. So essentially, who's there to enforce the laws?
Yeah, and what's happening in terms of, as far as that goes, like with the courts and stuff? Like, are you making filing stuff in courts, or is that happening online, or is that just not happening?
Well, it's a little bit of both. Okay. I mean, at the beginning, everything was pretty much shut down. Everything was paralyzed. Over the past few weeks, okay, there's been more opening up of emergency files and situations. We can talk about that as well, because unfortunately, those people that during the best of times are marginalized and are detained either for immigration or for mental health reasons, right? They're they're suffering further problems with that. But perhaps we'll get on that a little bit furthermore. Yeah, but just for the rental board, it's closed. There are emergency proceedings, but I mean, let's face it, judges and the judiciary, they're human beings as well.
Yeah.
They're not too happy if they have to go to court and necessarily risk their lives in getting there. They'll do it if they don't have a choice, but they're not necessarily happy campers.
But they'll risk getting sick, just like the bus drivers and subway drivers in New York and elsewhere. They're dying like flies.
Yeah. And once again, it's kind of like you don't necessarily want to be pleading your file in front of a judge who's not happy at the best of times, right? Especially if you're fighting for people that are marginalized and already have difficulty, getting any kind of representation. So yeah, so getting back to the whole question of the residences that were being closed. We went online with that. We got a petition. I think the first day, I think we got 5,000 signatures from the university community. Professors, students were outraged that the university was doing this.
Right.
Then, due to the force of solidarity, we managed to embarrass the heck out of the university so that they would that they finally changed their minds and said, okay. That's not what we meant to say. What we just want to reassure everyone is that we're not going to put anyone out in the street.
Yeah.
Find housing. Well,
because that's a big difference. So what they had said was we'll sort of help you, help advise you on finding housing or something like, and then it changed in a big way to we will find you housing. Right. That's a huge move.
Yeah,
which they pretended was not.
No, actually, the first one was even more blunt. Basically, they said you have to get out of here. Okay, it was essentially an eviction notice. That's what it was. And it was an eviction notice. which we fought on many different levels, right, including legally. But that being said, more importantly, it was the power of the people that made the change. It was really the public backlash of the possible risk to these young people that made the university change its mind. And we'll see, because publicly they have said that, but what's going to happen within the end of May, within the next week or so, is that school's going to be ending, and many of the student residents, traditionally once school has ended, they're supposed to be leaving their student residence to go back to their homes and countries of origin. The
Yeah,
problem, however, is that
yeah, no
people
flights.
can't. There's no flights.
Yeah.
You know? So it's like, what's going to happen to these people?
Yeah, yeah. And what has happened to other students in other places have not been as lucky as the ones you've been involved with defending there in Montreal, right? They have been kicked out.
Well, I mean, basically, they've been kicked out here at McGill. There's even a situation in which the university called the police in order to get them out. It's been horrendous. And, couch surfing. That's what happened.
Which is just great for the virus.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But the institutions aren't liable for that.
Yeah, and how many of these decisions that are being made in society are being made on that basis of like liability and like, I mean, I don't know, like what's been just happening. I know in the state of Georgia is they're opening up. They're saying we want to open up. The government wants to open up the state, even though the virus is spreading and on the rise, and all the mayors of all the cities in the state oppose opening up the state, but he wants to open up the state to business. And it seems like the whole thing is about like legal liability for all these unemployed people. And, it's just a bizarre way to make decisions during a pandemic. But such as I mean, we're really coming in, like sort of confronted in so many ways by the massive limitations of sort of capitalism and capitalist decision making to deal with a pandemic. I mean, it's really quite a lesson. Although what the outcome of the lesson will be, I have no idea. But you care to make any predictions? Or do you think people are learning from the mistakes there in Canada or anywhere else that you're hearing
Well,
about?
I think I'm an optimist. I think people are fundamentally good people. People are fundamentally concerned about one another, but it's a question of cutting through all the noise and trying to understand what the situation is. And the example I gave is, once again, the student resident situation where the officials stance of the university was this, right? But very quickly, people saw through that and said, "Well, what are you talking about? You're kicking them out for their benefit. I mean, come on, like." But and what's happening during this crisis is that the to borrow a term, the necessary illusions that many of us follow in this society, in this capitalist society, are falling wayside, and people are waking up, especially the working poor. I mean, for the working poor, they've always, many of them bought into these necessary illusions to keep on justifying, why they haven't done anything. But now, it's not enough. Those illusions won't hold up to buy you your groceries, prevent you from being part of that homeless, increasing population, and more importantly, it's also the question of who is so-called valued in a capitalist society, who are putting their lives at stake. I work a lot with young people and students, right? And so, when we talk about, many of the vulnerable workers, right, that are working in grocery stores and are working on the gig jobs, right? That's essentially the youth. And so, if they haven't been radicalized before, they're they're
Now they're
getting
on
their
the front
education now.
lines.
They're getting a good education now.
Hmm. Is there as far as just on the public health level, I mean, I know that there's the whole economic aspect, which is huge, but on the public health level, are the grocery workers and folks in those kinds of positions getting sick a lot more in Montreal, or is that not such a widespread phenomenon?
No, absolutely. There's a problem with that as well because once again, everyone was taken. Well, I should say everyone, but most people were taken by surprise by this pandemic, and so um, grocery stores they don't have necessarily. I mean, and there's different levels. There's the mom and pops, and then of course there's the big multinationals. But and, we don't see them unfortunately with the necessary protective gear. And what happens, and it's a little bit what do you call it, ironic, is that when you have especially the bigger chains, right? When you have one of the workers that finally becomes sick and becomes overly obviously evident that they're sick, right? Because some of these people, even though they're sick, they might not necessarily want to reveal it because they're trying to provide for their family. Then the whole store has to shut down when it becomes public. Now,
Mm.
if it's private, and no one knows about it, who knows? Did they really tell? No. So
Yeah,
last
that's
benefit.
lots of reasons not to talk about it. Yeah. And what's been, I imagine, I mean, we've been hearing, at least media junkies like myself, have been hearing a lot about dramatic increase in acts of one form or another of racist hostility in New York, especially. But has that been a big rise in Montreal and Chinatown?
It's been particularly problematic in that, Canada already has, as you had mentioned in your introduction, a long-standing history of racism, particularly towards people of Asian origin, but also to people of color in general. There's slavery, black slavery here. I'm not sure if many Americans are even aware of that, right? I mean, many Canadians aren't even aware of that.
No, I don't know how far back, because I'm in the U.S. When our association with slavery in Canada is one of the places that a lot of slaves escaped to, at least in the I don't know at what point that started becoming the case, but certainly in the beginning of the 1800s that was true. But I guess Canada had slavery before then. I haven't read about that.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yikes!
No, France
Right.
practiced slavery. Anyways,
Hmm.
we can talk about this some other time. But basically, Montreal was burned down in a situation where a Haitian slave was being punished for an accidental fire that had burned down, Montreal at that time, and as was the case, tortured and executed, and all those nasty things. Uh,
Mm.
but her I think white French Canadian boyfriend did not submit did not have the same kind of treatment, obviously. Uh,
Mm.
but going back to the whole question of racism, I just wanted to touch upon a point which perhaps we can also maybe share with your viewers, and that is, when we talk about racism, right, it's not just the questions of what we call, intentional racism, but also the impact of racism. Okay, what we call racist acts, right? Racism isn't just someone that comes up to you and says, "Hey, you're such and such," or whatever. Racism is also if uh, someone says like a joke or something that it might not be intentionally racism, but it makes you feel awful. It makes you feel bad, and it has something which endures on you, and that's what's happening right now. For example, in the lineups that are happening for supermarkets. If you're of like Asian origin, right? People have a tendency, unfortunately, in some sectors of Montreal or Quebec, to perhaps keep that distance a little bit make that distance longer, and as well to give you certain looks and stuff like that, and don't dare cough or even show any sign of illness, because if so, then whoa, it's going to cause all kinds of reactions, and that kind of racism, it's unfortunately, it's not intentional, okay, but still the impact of it is upon the person, and that's something which is happening more, in fact, to such a degree that there's been a support group that's been started up by I think around 2 or 3 thousand young people on Facebook that are just trying to express the difficulties having to deal with this, because in the best of times, getting health to mental health support, especially government support, is difficult. During these times, the hotlines are just inundated, and so people have. And once again, it's a question of solidarity, right? Is that some social workers, during their spare time, what they've done is they've set up a volunteer hotline, right, or volunteer Facebook, in which once or twice a week people can just phone in and express their stories, and as if and so in that sense, like racism, okay, it's really a health issue. When we talk about COVID-19, right, and talk about fighting the virus, okay, there's even we have a saying. It's like, stop the spread. And when we talk about stop the spread, it's not just the spread of the virus; it's the spread of racism. Okay, because racism is also a health issue. It's a health issue because it impacts people, their mental health, and then eventually as well, their physical health. And it's a cancer. For those people that perhaps have, maybe trouble conceptualizing it, right? It's the same way, for example, at one point when people talked about sexual violence and sexual harassment, it was a joke. It was accepted. Don't be so touchy and whatever else. And then as society became much more educated on this issue, they realized, whoa, there's a cost to that. Okay, and these costs are not just individual, but societal costs as well. And so that's what has to happen. That's what we're asking for, at least in Canada, from the part of our leadership, and I think definitely on the part of the U.S. as well, right? People are rising in order to say no, it's no longer acceptable. Okay, and not only that, but there's an impact, and that impact has to be addressed, because sooner or later, the effects of it are going to rise up, and it's going to bite you in the ass.
And there's all the sort of like impact of like the ways that fault lines in a society can be exacerbated by suddenly millions of people being thrown into poverty and uncertainty and feeling so isolated that the mental health, the stress that just everybody seems to be, or not everybody, but most people seem to be feeling in one way or another around here is it's just so evident when on the a few occasions you actually see a human being, but I wonder also like how toxic the whole atmosphere as far as racism and just how anybody is trying to deal with the global pandemic in the face of like, say, like three of the most major countries in the world being led by basically fascists, like Trump, Bolsonaro, and Modi. I mean, these three leaders, and not to mention so many others, but just these three alone, like the sort of like the sort of what the baseline that they're setting in terms of on debate and response is just, and withholding funding from the WHO, and I mean, it's just a bit overwhelming, but. Trump must also really cause a toxic, and people like Ford, I imagine, in Ontario, and these kinds of nationalist, racist types must also be. Are they enjoying a lot more popularity in Canada as people like Ford? Are they?
Well, see, and that's the danger, right? I mean, I always say to people, know your history. Okay, know your history, right? Look back at the 1930s. Take a look at how Mussolini came to power. Take a look at how Hitler came to power. And at first they might go, "What? What are you talking about? Hitler and Mussolini." So take a look at how these extreme fascist right wing governments, okay, came to power. Take a look at how people suffered. And then take a look at the world around us today, right? And that's where really it's important to try to communicate with people in a way that they understand. Um, and it's really that people once again are fundamentally caring. The only thing is that they just have to be, you know, uh, exposed to the suffering of other people. And you just take a look at, like, we get the bad news all the time, but at the same time we get like a tremendous amount of good news, right?
It's been a lot of a lot of mutual aid that's going on in a lot of places for sure, eh?
Yeah, on the first step, but then we got to step it up, right?
Yeah.
And so, okay, people are sacrificing their lives, but why? What is the cause behind that? Why do they? Why do and we can go on and on about that, but why do the working poor have to be on the front line, okay, in
Mm.
order to the protect and render safe those people who are in a much more privileged elite position.
Yeah,
And
how about the investment bankers? I mean, they're just going to benefit. They're just going to keep on demanding their rent as they're doing. Is what's going on with things like, as far as that kind of thing goes, for all the people who are suddenly in the ranks of the non-working poor now up there? Is there a suspension on rents or a deferment on mortgages that's going on,
Oh,
or
absolutely. That was, I mean, I guess that's maybe one of the advantages of having a slightly more, a socialist country.
yeah,
and, and that was one of the first things that,
that happened there first thing?
yeah,
Deferment on mortgages and suspension of
absolutely.
rents is nationwide.
That's nationwide. Yeah.
Wow.
That's, um, I
What's the timeline? Did they do a 3-month thing and then update it later, kind of thing, or is it? Do you know?
I'm not too sure. I think it's about. I mean, at the very least, as I said, for evictions, right? No one is to be evicted for 3 months. I think it's something similar as the United States, and most likely that's going to be longer, depending upon the situation.
Mm.
Um, the and as for mortgages and everything else, the banks have been um, forward thinking in this. But let's not forget, I mean, the Canadian banks, yeah, I mean, they're like any other capitalist bank. They're thinking of their own, but at the very least, they're thinking for them, of their own benefit. But their own benefit, they've realized, is to have a healthy population and a population that won't overturn them. Flashback to the depression era.
Right. It is. I mean, it is pretty remarkable how. I mean, not so much in the United States, but I mean, well, even in the United States, although the response has been so disastrous here, but even in the United States, and throughout the I don't know what you call it, but the countries, the industrialized countries that have budgets for this sort of thing, basically, like there's been this response, which has been, just it all these decades that we've been told austerity budgets and the rising of costs and everything getting more expensive, rent, mortgages, everything. All this time we've been told these things are just some kind of inevitable aspect of the society, and like just we're stuck with this whole thing, and there's nothing to be done. And suddenly we find out, oh, there's all kinds of things that can be done. Suddenly, if when public health is at issue, and when it's like 1% of the rich that also stand to die from the pandemic, along with a larger percentage of the poor, suddenly there's all the rules are all changed.
Oh yeah, and this is gonna last for a while. Anyways, it's everyone. Well, I mean, most experts say, look, this is just the first wave. This
Yeah.
is the first wave. The second wave is going to be worse. And so we'll see. And obviously, there hasn't even been a vaccination that's been finalized. And it's a vaccination. It's not a cure. So that's another thing as well.
And we're all becoming amateur epidemiologists these days. And in 1918, in the pandemic, the global pandemic of 1918, it was the second wave that was the deadly wave, and the second wave was deadly because of the circumstances, the artificial circumstances in which it became deadly, which was the front lines of the First World War in Europe, and then it spread to the rest of the world as the war ended and the soldiers were sent home to everywhere, and then they spread the second wave of the pandemic, that very deadly second wave, which was bred in the hospitals in Europe, and the trains, and where, because normally, like, people, if they're really sick, they go off somewhere and die, whereas with this second wave of the 1918 pandemic, it spread because even though people were very sick, they were being moved around on trains and in hospitals, and they were infecting hospital staff and all kinds of other people. And I think what's so bizarre and fascinating and macabre and horrifying about the situation today is it looks like the second wave of this pandemic is going to be the deadly wave, and it's going to be deadly because of exactly the same kinds of conditions that made the second wave of the pandemic in 1918 deadly, which is just a shocking repeat of almost 100 years to the day.
Know your history. Know your
Yeah.
history. Mm, mm.
And speaking of knowing your history, Walter, I am also struck by the way that China is being scapegoated today in so many different ways, but the variety of parallels between the way China gets scapegoated and the way Ch- Asian people in North America, especially, have been scapegoated historically, like around the time of the Chinese and the Asian Exclusion Acts in Canada and U.S. Like, and but there's so many parallels. Like, I mean, using people for their labor and then scapegoating them afterwards. Like, it's such a it's like a script, and it's just being repeated. I wonder if you have any particular thoughts on that.
Well, it's not a script. Basically, it's a way of crisis management. It works. Hey, listen,
Scapegoating.
Machiavellian works. So this is the capitalist society that we live in. What do we expect from capitalists?
But we need to understand how they operate, and
Absolutely.
what is this crisis playbook they're operating on.
Yeah, and if anything, one thing which really and we, as militants and advocates, those that work in community, we need to learn from our own failings, right? For example, the Occupy movement. Why couldn't we go beyond that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or anyways, there's all the other movements that have happened as well. The anti-globalization, to a certain degree, it's lost a little bit more of its momentum.
That's for sure.
And so it's really a question of, okay, you had the initial, you know you had the initial outpour of anguish and frustration, but like, conserve energy, okay, in order to go on to the next step, because that's what's happening right now. I see, those people that are uh, like the everyday people who once again are on the front lines, okay, even the nurses and the health, they're going to be they're buying into the fact that, okay, yes, they're being heroes, yes, we love them, but what happens to them afterwards? 9/11. what
Yeah.
what happened to most of these, people that the first responders that, provide the help? What systems were in place? And that's what we have to look towards. We're dealing with the day to day, right? I mean, I talk about racism. We're setting up mechanisms in order to denounce, but at the same time, we want to help people go to the next step and question, Why are these systems? Why are these, the borrowed term from Chomsky? Why are these power systems there?
Yeah.
How do they work? How can we, redistribute that power, so that it comes back to the people?
And it seems like there's a lot of that kind of thinking, a lot of questioning is going on. I mean, just like in terms of like memes that you see on the internet and the graphics people are sharing on Facebook groups and on Reddit and stuff. I mean, there's just like, I mean, I know a lot of people are stuck at home with nothing much to do. So if they're good at making graphics, they're going to be making graphics right about now. But there's a lot of this sort of redistributive kind of thinking going on that I wonder where it's going to go when people are able to be back out on the streets. Are people going to be on the streets like after there's no more suspension on evictions? What happens? I mean, not paying your rent during a suspension on evictions is sort of like, I've been calling it it's sort of like a rehearsal for a rent strike. But a real rent strike is, of course, when when there's you might be evicted but you're still not paying your rent. Perhaps that could be
Yeah,
said.
but the impact is there, David.
Either way, yeah.
Yeah, people don't necessarily have to. If people can not pay their rent and not have to suffer immediate impact of that, why not? I mean,
Oh yeah.
because the landlord, for them, it's a question of, well, I'm not getting money in.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it be for, like, now 3 months or whatever else, or later on, right? That impact, it's really now that the people have the power. And if they don't,
Right.
if they don't grab that power, if they don't make it known, then that moment will have passed.
Yeah.
And and things will, unfortunately, go. Unfortunately, people will go back to their, NFL and NBA, and I mean, and they'll continue to have, they'll continue to drink the Kool-Aid. I guess I hate to use that term, but. Uh,
But this is one of those moments, huh? One of those precipice moments when it
Absolutely.
seems like when people things could get pushed in a very positive or a very negative direction, depending on where the momentum goes. And
Yeah, but change is there. Change is happening. But the question is, um, like any, as you said, at some point, right? Will people become, see that there's will there be hope? Okay, there's got to be some hope, right? Or will they become so disenfranchised that there'll be further, self hurt. When we think about, remember, the race riots back, during the civil rights. Many of the property destruction was to their own neighborhoods. And
although
yeah,
mostly to people who are renting property, I always hasten to add to that. I mean, it's certainly true. Of course, when you're burning down a neighborhood that you live in, it's going to be having a massive impact on your life primarily. But these were rental properties, so burning down a building that is a rental property is also a way of getting back at those people that live in another neighborhood that in many cases were actually part of the 0.1% of the population. When you look at the amount of money that can be made from owning an apartment complex full of poor people, it's astounding. And there's a great book called Evicted about Milwaukee and landlords in both in a black and a white neighborhood in Milwaukee, and just how much money they make off of people that are on welfare or barely scraping by.
yeah. But and the other thing too is, let's take a look at, also at the lessons that, I hate to say it, but the extreme right has, how they managed to hijack the Republican Party. Uh, there's money behind it for sure, but there's also, like, a lot of organized, organized anger and change. And yeah, I don't know, but basically, as I said, don't just get angry, you get organized.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, we could go off on many different subjects, right? We talked about, about housing, If we could talk more about questions of. I think you had mentioned. I think immigration as well. Um, do you want to get into that
I
at
would
this
love
point?
to. Yeah, I'd love to. And there's been deportations happening, as I'm sure you've heard, with people with COVID-19 being deported to out of the U.S. and spreading it to other countries. What's been happening in your neck of the woods?
Well, I mean, basically, number one, flights have stopped for all intents and purposes, right? And so, if anything, I think it's more a question of um, the people that are in detention, um, the people without paper, right? That's the expression we use in, I guess, French.
Sans papier.
Sans
Yeah,
papier,
yeah,
um, that because the I guess the general term which the corporate media uses is illegals, right?
yeah.
I mean, illegal for what? For not necessarily having a visa or whatever else when your life is in danger. But anyways, so
Hmm.
so really, what happened and what's been happening ever since Trump was elected was that there's been a huge deluge of refugee claimants and people in fear of their lives and they don't want to go back to their countries of origin because the situation has been extremely they're oftentimes fleeing from situations of violence. It could be generalized violence as well, right? Where they just don't feel secure, you know. And so they've been coming to Canada, and it's been going on since like pretty much since Trump got elected, and so the system's been inundated, um, and so Canada has been trying to to deal with this situation. Um, at the best of times, there's oftentimes the people that come here without papers. If there's a question about their identity, then they're detained first and foremost until they can show, who they really are, right? And so there's like this temporary process of detention. The problem, however, is in this crisis situation, right? Uh,
Mm.
it's going to be almost impossible for these people to get their proper papers. And oftentimes, when people cross borders, right, they're not going to keep their papers on them necessarily because that they've been told by, the people helping them come across, don't have your papers on you. Okay, they'll follow whatever instructions are given to them by the the people getting them across. And so uh, people who normally would be detained for like maybe a few days, right now it's going to turn into weeks, my God, months, because they can't get that proper identification. And then also for those people that have already gone through the refugee system and for whatever reason, okay, haven't been able to show um, that they're convention refugees, right? Unfortunately, these people are detained in situations which are a health risk. It's the same thing, obviously, for the general prison population, which is also horrific. There have been hunger strikes that have started way back in March, as a result of this. Even more recently, because we talk about physical distancing, the
There's
prison,
none of that in the
no,
yeah.
no, the detention centers or whatever else, right? There's none of that, right?
And the prisons, there's also hunger strikes going on in the prisons. Have you been here? Are you in touch
Uh,
with any of that?
I'm not quite sure. I know because I'm more of an immigration lawyer, so I
Yeah,
know that for sure. Um, but it's a situation in which now it's been revealed that immigration guards have been
they're
found,
getting it.
right? So
Is it
obviously,
looking like there's any chance that they're going to empty the detention centers?
some detention centers have been emptied.
Hmm.
Uh, you know. We'll see. Like the longer this goes, right, then there could be a chance that especially depending upon how the unions react, right? Because let's not forget that the border guards, many of these are also they're employees and the unionized people. If the unions can fight to get protection for their people, they might say, well, look, do these people are these people being detained? Are they really a risk for for the government? Aren't there other ways in which we could just have them report online or something just to present their identity? I mean, if they're in Canada to begin with, right, that means that they're here. They're not going to disappear necessarily, you know? So, anyways,
Yeah.
these are the concerns.
In the little time that we have left, Walter, can I just randomly switch gears and ask you about questions about your youth? Would you mind just telling us, like, I mean, I
Sure.
just like the growing up in Montreal, and you're in your 20s, and there's this massive social movement going on the other side of the world, obviously in a country that you have a lot of relationship with, but not everybody just decides they're going to fly across the Pacific and hang out in the middle of a huge protest that's going on, which obviously you didn't necessarily know was going to end the way it ended, but still, it was it's quite a move, and I don't know how many other North Americans did you meet in Tiananmen Square who had made the same decision? I think I'll go check this out and
Yeah.
live in a tent.
Well, I'll have to admit that started really in Colombia, in South America, because when I was about 19 years old, I went to South America, Colombia in particular, in order to do what we call education development work, and that's where my consciousness was really raised as to the extremes of of the capitalist system and supposedly a democratic state, because at that time in the late 80s, mid 80s, right, we're civil war, there was like narco trafficking. It was just horrible, the situation in Colombia. Not too much better now, but anyways, that's a whole nother issue. And so I saw the extremes of capitalism, and then when I had the chance after near I just finished off my studies in law, and I was offered a chance to travel, and so I thought, well, why not go to China, you know? And so the initially the plan was just to travel. Then I found out, and my parents, brought to my attention, of course, that there was civil unrest in China, and,
And they wanted you to stay away.
oh yeah, but I said, oh no, I got to get there even faster. So basically, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the long story short, the people that were supposed to meet up with me and whatever else, unfortunately, they had uh, they had already split. So they by the time when I arrived, right, martial law had already been declared, and so I was pretty much on my own. And but as you said, if you're a person that believes in social change and social justice, right, you just can't talk the talk. You gotta walk the walk. You gotta get in there. You gotta get your hands dirty. We talked about revolution being dirty. Oh my God! Can you imagine? A public place where you have almost 1 million people, no public toilets. Think about that.
Must have been a disaster.
It was, it
But
was
it's so much easier to, in a way. I mean, easier in a sense. It's like there's all the danger and all the risk involved. But other than that, it's so much easier to get involved with a movement when there's a movement happening, isn't it? Like when people say, "Oh, get up in the morning and think of something to do," that's not the same as like, "Oh, there's 1 million people in the streets. I'll go join them." Right?
no, but there's always that risk because they
Yeah.
knew. I mean, the younger people, I guess maybe that's why the movement came a little bit from that, right? It's always that question of invincibility, of the feeling of wow, we can change stuff. Whereas the older generation, the Cultural Revolution was still very fresh in their memory. The lessons of the repression by the state was still very fresh in their memory. And they said to us, he said, You know, be very, very, very careful. There's going to be a price to pay. We didn't think that at the time, right? That you know, maybe the naivety of youth, okay, that price would be so bloody. But at the same time, my own memories of Tiananmen Square and the massacre are really not of you know the traumatic events that were displayed globally, but it was during that month of incredible widespread solidarity, not just by young people, but by all people. I was, based more in Beijing during that time, right? And it was like, the workers were coming out. My God, even the police were coming out. Maybe there's one anecdote I just want to give is at the beginning of the marches, okay, essentially, the students, we went out mainly during the night. We did the bicycle. Back in those days, there's all bicycles, right? So hundreds of thousands of, or tens at least, hundreds of thousands of bicycles going through the street, um, because we knew that Beijing at that time was a population of 10 million. It'd be too difficult for the tanks to come in, um, because there was like a military barracks station at the north of Beijing, without causing too many casualties at that time. So if they're going to come in, it was going to be during the night, and so every night we would patrol the streets, and we would sleep during the day. Um, and so that very first night where the tanks were supposed to come in, I think it was on the 15th of May or whatever, uh, we managed to go out and meet up with them. And because of the fact that the military people at that time spoke the same dialect as us, for people that may not realize it, there are many dialects in China. It'd be the difference between, let's say, Spanish and English or French. And so, luckily, those military people were from around Beijing. They had told us, that they were there to control the criminals and vandals that had overtaken the city, and they were going to put like public order. Sounds familiar, doesn't that?
Very.
America.
Mm.
But I mean, their intentions were like, yeah, we're here to help the people, and they said, no, 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 that's not what's happening.
You
And
guys were talking to them, and
yeah, we
yeah.
were talking to them, we were speaking to them, and so eventually what happened was that they just, instead of pushing through, they stopped, you know and it got to the point where, in fact, the people that the military people that actually came in and massacred all the people on June 4th, well, the night of June 3rd, the morning of June 4th, they weren't from around Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
They had moved them in from other parts of the country where they spoke a different dialect. Uh,
Wow. A
and it,
different dialect that's so different that actually they don't understand each other when they come to Beijing. Like unless they, or does everybody learn like the sort of equivalent of like what they call in Germany high German or something like a
no,
particular.
it's a it's a different dialect. It's but a different dialect, and not only that, but they weren't from Beijing. So they're from like another, kind of another part of the country. Like imagine taking people from one state, right, and then having them let's say taking I shouldn't use American.
I mean, the parallels in America. I mean, with the not aside from the dialect thing, the parallels. There's loads of parallels in terms of like the way Shea's rebellion in Massachusetts was put down. It was by taking soldiers from other states and sending them to Massachusetts, because the Massachusetts soldiers basically left the ranks of the militia and joined the rebels when given the chance.
Yeah, because he knew the people. They had an
Yeah,
affinity, and so it's like, well, wait a minute. Once they found out the truth, and
yeah,
that's always the thing, trying to get the truth out, trying to make the communicate. Once it was communicated to them, right, then okay. And this is why I always like, when people say, oh, they're anti, military, anti-police, I'd say, okay, that's all right, but at the same time, police are people too, and military people too. What you have to do is reach out to them, not as
Yeah.
a military, but as a person, as like a human being. And if that message goes through, right, that that can make the difference.
Because even if yeah, because like putting it into into a current context, any of those cops have relatives that have just lost their jobs or just gotten COVID-19 or are at risk of getting something or are working in a hospital, or they're just people like the rest of us, and they have the same kinds of relatives. And
Yeah.
yeah. Walter, it has been a wonderful pleasure and privilege having you on my live stream show, which someday might have more than 14 viewers, like even by tomorrow. But yeah, yeah. Thank
Okay,
you so much for
no
joining
problem.
us.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much, Dave. And it's always a pleasure, spending time with you and being part of your community.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for joining my community, whatever community this is. They're out there somewhere, But yeah, on
Take
the
care.
other side of the screen. You too, Walter. See you soon.
Bye.
And thank you, that community, whoever you are out there, whoever those 14 live viewers are, and whoever else might be watching this afterwards on whatever platforms. Thanks for tuning in to today's discussion, which was with Walter, Chee, and Tom from Montreal, Quebec. You'll find it archived shortly in the Discussions with David playlist at youtube.com/drovix, and as the latest episode of the podcast this week with David Rovix, among various other places, such as at davidrovix.com and on the David Rovix mobile app. Starting on Mondays will be dedicated to hosting an online open mic. If you're watching this broadcast live, whether it's on YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, Twitch, VK, LinkedIn, or on my website, the open mic will be broadcast on these platforms, just like I'm doing now. I'll host it on a platform called StreamYard, which allows me to bring guests in and out smoothly and things like that. To participate in Pandemic Open Mic Mondays, please sign up on the sign up sheet at davidrovix.com/POMM. And I'm gonna be really high tech. I should have prepared this in advance, but look, I can even display that right here on the screen. I'm so high tech. Here we go. Yeah. And sign up at davidrovix.com/POMM. And if you know any musicians or poets or other people who might like to participate in an open mic, please let them know. I hope to see you on Monday here in the Matrix and eventually back in the streets. Stay calm and don't pay the rent.